Welcome to Conflict Managed. I'm your host, Mary Brown. Conflict Managed is a weekly podcast about toxic work environments and how to fix them. We're glad you're here. Good morning, Ali, and welcome to Conflict Managed.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to be talking with you this morning and about everything that you're up to with Ready Cultures and interested in workplace, healthy work environments, which I'm very much interested into. So I know we're going to have a fabulous conversation. But before we get to what you're doing right now, can you tell me about the very first job you had as a young person?
It wasn't quite the first job, but close to the first job. It was in retail, and I worked at this uniform store. They sold uniforms for doctors and chefs for services. And it was a very eye-opening experience. I was in college. I was working part-time. I was figuring myself out still, which who isn't in college? And I had a very interesting experience because the manager who was there was not the best manager. She would smile a lot with customers, and then they'd leave, and she'd start criticizing them. She'd criticize employees when they were on their days off, and it just very quickly showed me how not to be when I knew I would eventually become a manager and hopefully not treat people like that, even if it was just behind their backs.
That is so very telling because if somebody is talking behind other people's backs, we know they're probably talking about us. And I'm very interested in gossip and healthy work environments, and of course, how gossip leads away from them. Why do you think she was behaving that way?
I don't know. It could have been a personal situation where maybe just her own background or her own personal environment wasn't great. The place where I worked was also just not very well run from sort of management, even beyond
Mm.
her, right? She was a local franchise manager, but the onboarding experience, I remember, was very difficult. And part of it came from this person, but also just the materials and the paperwork and all of the things that come with onboarding just didn't quite land. So it could have been partly just frustration on her part and how she let it out.
Mhm.
And gossip, to your point, does, create a negative effect. There's healthy gossip and then there's not so healthy gossip. And unfortunately, the negative tends to always outweigh the positive in cultures.
That's a really interesting reflection because a lot of times when we are experiencing a behavior that we find negative, so this sort of toxic gossip, um, then a lot of times, of course, we want to blame the person in front of us. They're doing it because there's something defective in them, full stop. Instead of, I mean, it could be that this was a behavior that she picked up, a coping mechanism, well, who knows? But it could also, as you said, because she's frustrated with how she's not getting information that she needs, right? So this kind of gossip usually happens because either people are trying to make connections and they don't have healthy ways to do it, or lack of transparency, lack of communication, and it shows as frustration. And a lot of times we just see what's presented to us and don't really know why it's happening, but it definitely is a helpful sign to know that something is going wrong.
Absolutely. And that connection piece is so true. I find that everywhere I've worked, whether it's in retail or, in professional services, that connection piece is so, so, so important. And it's part of why I do what I do, because to me that there's the operational piece and then there's the relational piece. And you need both to
Mhm.
really have a strong and thriving culture. And sometimes some companies do the operational piece really well, but the communication piece that kind of ties that relational piece to it just isn't there. And it makes a really big difference. And people really crave that connection and they crave that understanding and that clarity, which you need both. You
Mhm.
absolutely need both.
And I'm getting off a little bit of the flow that I normally go through, but I want to talk more about this because I'm very interested in this. A lot of what I see on my social media feeds and people being very frustrated with work culture as we see it today. And so you see a lot of this. I'm not there to make friends. I just do my work and I leave, or this quiet quitting. And it is very interesting. Like, we've been told like what's supposed to go on at work. It's this family, and you're supposed to have this sort of loyalty, and yet it's certainly not a family, and they're not loyal to me. Why should I be loyal to them? And so it's like I'm either going to have a family at work or I'm going to be completely disengaged. I don't need friends. My friends are at home. I don't, and so really not understanding what does it mean to be a good professional, a good colleague, the connection, not only to do good work, but the sense of belonging because we're human persons wherever we go. So what do you see is going on there as this sort of weird place we are in? What are we supposed to be doing with our colleagues at work?
Well, for starters, I am very hesitant about the family term
Yeah,
because some people may have lovely families, some people may have terrible families. And so to associate that, I think, is a really dangerous direction to take something. Now, certainly, I've worked places who use the term and it worked wonderfully for them. But I think the piece that's missing is so many companies, you mentioned culture, and I like to define culture very differently than most. So when you think of culture, people generally define it as, oh, well, culture is just this sort of common set of traits or ways of doing things. And sure, maybe, but to me, it's not very actionable. I like to think of culture more as the conditions under which you want things to grow or not grow. I take that sort of from the science definition, right? When you're in science, you have the little petri dish, you create those conditions, it grows or doesn't grow. Um, and to me, that changes how you view culture and it changes how you view people's interactions with it. Certainly, there are people who just want to go and get their paycheck and leave. And that's okay if they're not harming anyone and they're still doing a good job. But at the end of the day, if you're creating conditions that you expect certain people or people at your company to thrive in, that's going to affect and impact how they behave. And internal communications is a really big part of that because it influences that behavior. And I don't think people necessarily are looking for connection in the sense that they want, their best friend and happy hour buddy, but I think they want connection in the sense that they want to understand why they're there and they want to do a good job. And I think so many companies are missing that. And so you have these people who are like, I'm just over it. I'm quiet quitting because I don't understand what's happening and no one's telling me anything and no one's being clear. And to me, that's the missing piece. And so you can kind of understand why people feel so disconnected and so disengaged because if they feel like they're not really clear on why they're even there, they're gonna not feel very great or committed to what they're doing,
yeah,
you know?
yeah, absolutely. That internal communication, people just want to know. Adults just want to know. Tell them what's going on, give them enough information so they can make informed decisions and do good work. And I think that we need to reimagine, like when we think about culture. I love the petri dish idea because something's growing, right? So we can decide, what it is that we want to grow. There, you're going to have a certain kind of culture. So what is it, right? And so to curate it and to maintain it so that you get the desired outcome that you want, which is a flourishing environment for everybody. And so I think we need to reimagine, like what it means to work to be in different environments. So like when you're at home or when you're in the community or when you're with this group that you maybe volunteer with or you're wherever you might be, there are different kinds of cultures that require different things of us, right? And so I absolutely I'm not hesitant to say throw out the family. Let's not talk about it. It's just inappropriate at
Yeah,
work, right? It's just because,
yeah.
as you said, we don't know about people's family of origin. And even if everybody right there at that moment is on board with it, the next person that comes in, they might just have to smile through it as,
Mhm.
every time they hear that, they just think, you have no idea what that means in my family. But,
Yeah.
like what does it mean to be a good colleague? How can I be a good colleague without thinking I need a drinking buddy or a best friend or someone who's going to be the godparent to my child, right? I mean, you could find, and people do find lifelong friends. Sometimes people find spouses at work, but how can we be collegial know enough about the people on our teams to be able to work well together. And there's a lot of research that says when you find a work buddy, and I mean that in the most professional kind of way, your work increases because, as you said, this idea of feeling seen, being a part of, even just somebody else to try to understand what's going on, to have a trusted, colleague to kind of bounce ideas off of. But when we go it alone in a group, it feels like something's not right.
That's so true. I'm a big introvert, right? And even I crave buddies, right? I like my alone time. I like my moments of silence, but that connection, even through buddies, is important. And I remember I worked at a company once that had this what they called a buddy system for new hires, which I actually really appreciated because it wasn't just this idea of welcome, here's your checklist for onboarding, off you go, or it didn't just rely on your manager to tell you everything. And instead, it assigned people a buddy. Sometimes it was in the same office, sometimes it was a different office, didn't have to even be in the same department. I don't remember who I got paired with, but it wasn't someone in the comms or marketing department. But I remember made me feel a part of something because I had someone I knew I could go to ask questions when I was unsure about where to find something. And I used that resource wonderfully and often. Um, and now, did I continue to keep in touch with that person throughout my career? Not necessarily, but just having that even in the beginning was so incredibly helpful. That's exactly it. I mean, I think people often separate this idea of work and personal life. And at the end of the day, it's intermingled whether you want it to be or not. And so if you want to think about how you thrive in your outside of work life, it's a similar concept. You want to treat people with respect. You want to be, you know, a normal, kind human being, and you want to communicate in a way that's clear to others what you're expecting of them and what's expected of you. And I think so many people forget that and think that it's just this little bubble or this little pocket of what's that popular show on HBO or is it Apple TV, the Innie and the Outie? I'm
Yeah,
completely
severance.
blanking. Yeah,
Love
it's
it.
Severance,
Yeah.
right? It's just like that show. And sure, I understand people want clear definitions and separation, but there's that separation of wanting to close your laptop and finish your work for the day. And then there's the idea that if you have a toxic environment or if you have a positive environment, that's going to impact your personal life because you're going to be thinking about it in your personal life. You can't
Mhm.
really fully disconnect the two.
Right.
So,
Yeah. We think about if I'm working on a team with 4 people, how much better am I going to be able to work more efficiently, creatively, be more engaged if I just have a good working relationship with these people rather than I think, I don't want to know anything about you. I don't need to, it's just this very disconnected, disjointed. And I'm very interested in professionalism, right? Sharing appropriately at work. But what does that look like to be a good colleague so that I can do good work, so that I can feel comfortable and I understand your working style, you understand mine, I can come to you. We've all had those colleagues where it's just very easy. Um, and we've had some colleagues where it's harder, but we can still work. And then we've got those some colleagues where we feel like the knives are out. Like you don't want to see me coming and you don't want to work with me. How am I supposed to get my work done? Right. So how do we make those allowing all different kinds of personalities, because there are all different ages, personalities, backgrounds, but to be able to have that ease, that professional ease, so that we can all do good work and move forward. Right. And so I want to say one other thing about this buddy system, which I love, but in addition to, you could also think about this as people who want to move up in the organization. What are personal development opportunities? And one of them is for people who've been there a while to be mentors, to have this opportunity to show this person around, but then it also shows people in the organization higher ups that they are interested in being developed and developing others. And so it seems like such a wonderful piece that could be used for in many different ways, and also reverse mentoring. And that's just a wonderful idea. I'm very interested in onboarding and onboarding well. So that sounds fantastic.
yeah, I love the idea of mentorship and I was very lucky early in my career when I started in working in law firms, which I worked in for about 15 years. my first boss, I was right out of college, and she wasn't just a boss, she was a mentor. And it made all the difference because it allowed me to see what working in her role looked like because she included me in meetings. I was very junior. I remember going to a meeting with her with the chairman of the firm at the time and thinking like, "Oh my God, am I supposed to be here?" But she trusted in me and she said, Come with me, let's talk to this person." And it it really, I think, set the foundation for how I wanted to work and how I wanted to interact with others. And having that really, I think, taught me how to just be professional and how to treat others with respect. And I was very lucky to have that. Now, granted, I like to think that I was already a good, kind person going into it, but seeing it in action with someone who was very senior and who was willing to take the time to support and guide me, I think just really made a huge difference in the trajectory of my career.
Mm.
And I also think that that connection between wanting to do a good job at work and wanting to, the example you gave of the four people, you work on a team of four people. How do I make sure that I'm interacting with them in a way that is productive, but also just feeling like I'm not completely ruining a relationship? It comes back down to this idea that, sure, there's this sort of team bond, but if you're working in a dysfunctional company that isn't communicating things clearly or providing guidance on how things should be done, growing those conditions under which you want things to thrive, doesn't matter how positive your immediate team is, the disconnect is still there and it's going to affect the day to day. So again, it goes back to that relational and that operational, especially, when you're talking about work.
Yeah, that's such a good point because sometimes when we're experiencing a problem at work with a particular person, a boss or just a colleague, a lot of times we tend to think the whole place is on fire. And it could just be this little pocket. And then sometimes people make the mistake of thinking my pocket is just fine and everything else is on fire, right? So, you know, it so much depends on what we're experiencing and how we're feeling. Um, but there are many layers to it, and that really is a good point. Just because a particular group is working well together, if things are dysfunctional and if there isn't transparency and there's actual disjointed communication, of course it impacts what you're able to do and what you're going to be doing moving forward. I do like that you said that you felt trusted by this mentor that you had. And that is, people mostly want that, right? That they want the people that work for them, this trust, but you don't get it by saying trust me, right? You get it by witnessing. You had this up close and personal feeling that you got from this person, right? By the things that she was doing. Um, that is just a wonderful gift to be given, especially to a young professional.
Trust is huge. I actually heard a podcast about a year ago. It was the Adam Grant Work Life podcast,
Mhm.
and he interviewed Airbnb's Brian Chesky, CEO Brian Chesky. And I remember he said a line that has stuck with me since I heard that, which is employees don't have to agree with you, but they have to trust you. And I've seen that played out time and time again in where I've worked, whether it's on a team I led or elsewhere. And that trust is just essential to a strong, happy, healthy culture and the success and productivity of a business, right? And to me, what that means is if you're a leader, whether you're the leader of a company or a team, a department or a team, you need to be able to instill that trust through your actions, not just your words, right? Sort of walking the talk. And there will be times when you will need to make difficult decisions because that is the world we live in. And sometimes people won't agree. But if you are being thoughtful about how you are communicating these things and acting on them and saying, we've done this before, or we have, we're facing this difficult situation and I understand it's going to be really stressful, but I'm here to guide you through it. And all of these things make a difference. And I can actually think of one example. I worked at when I was working in house, this was during COVID, and I remember the senior person I was working with had sent out a communication about a decision he had made, and someone responded and was very much in disagreement with the person and was basically saying, "This is terrible. How could you do this?" All of this. And I remember this person came to me, this senior leader came to me and said, "Well, what should I do? Should I just ignore their email? Like what? Like I'm not changing my decision." And I remember I said to him, I said, "Just reply. Just acknowledge that you've seen their email and that you appreciate their feedback and that you're still sticking to your decision because of X, Y, and Z reasons."
Mhm.
And he did that. And the person who had sent the email wrote back and said, "Thank you so much. I didn't think you would reply. I really appreciate that. Thank you." And that was it. The person felt heard. The person
Mhm.
felt like they could speak up without, some kind of retaliation.
Mhm.
Things continued as they needed to be. And I think that that went a long way because that person probably then took that and said, "Wow, this person replied to me and told a colleague." And it spoke to the actions and not just the words that the person was saying, and then instilled that trust, I
Mhm.
think, through that.
That's a great everyday example. I mean, we want mechanisms to be heard. And also thinking like, how is trust built? It's built in the everyday, right? It's in the goodwill. It's in doing what I say I'm going to do, whoever you are in the organization, right? So whether you're the senior leader or you're brand new, are you going to do what you say you're going to do at a certain kind of quality that you say you're going to do at the time that you say you're going to do it? All of these sorts of things. And I see that day in and day out. And so I have built this relationship with you. And so I'm either trusting you or not trusting you, given the everyday interactions. And so when big things happen and I really disagree with you, I might feel like that having that psychological safety that I can say, hey, is this really what we're going to do given this? And then the leader or whoever the boss is can say yes or no. And we're thank you for your impact or your feedback, but this is why we're going to do it. And we're more likely to be able to keep on going in an organization with something we disagree on if we feel we've been heard and if there is trust. Most professional adults realize you're not going to get your way all the time, that you don't see everything that people in higher positions see, nor should you. And sometimes you're just going to disagree. So, what are you going to do next? Right. So, am I going to
Right.
just go ahead? Or is it such a big deal breaker that I'm going to have to leave?
Yeah. It's so true. I read an article recently about this idea that some businesses are using this phrase of, well, everyone's replaceable, everyone's fungible, and they just need to get with the act and get it together. And I remember reading that article and thinking, "Oh, that is so short-sighted.
Mhm.
Of course, everyone knows they're replaceable. We're all adults. We know that. But if you want us working for you, you probably want to treat us with respect and not like this disposable thing."
Yeah.
Right? And that goes back to how do you communicate and relay the values and the systems and the way that you run the business. And that's going to trickle down to everyone. And it's going to trickle down to how they interact with each other. It's going to trickle down to um, just how they do their work. And it goes back to this earlier conversation we had, which is people crave connection. They want to feel heard. They don't have to agree, but they want to feel heard.
Mhm.
And to just say, "Well, someone's replaceable, just deal with it." I think that sets a pretty clear, un understanding of how that work environment is and probably won't last very long.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, are you going to get people's best? Are you going to get their creativity? Are you going to get their innovation? No, you're not going to get, are you going to get institutional memory? No. If you treat people like machines, it turns out they're not, and they're not cogs. So it's this idea that if you really have a people-centric culture and you treat your people well, it takes time and intention, but you get so much more time and you get so much more out of them than if you treat them
Mm.
as these replaceable objects, because people aren't objects. So you're not going to get the optimal benefit of your workforce. It's it seems so straightforward. It doesn't seem like
It
it's not
really
rocket science.
does. It really does. And I just think for for many leaders, they're so focused on these hard skills of productivity and numbers and profits, which, yes, those are very important things. You run a business.
Right.
But how do you make that happen? You make that
Yeah.
happen with the people, and that comes with soft skills. That comes
Yeah.
with, the ability to communicate and the ability to engage, and it's that EQ that so many, I think, forget is just as essential to a company's bottom line, but also just to the day-to-day culture. And it just boggles my mind that so many companies seem to miss out on that. And sure, people might leave. That's okay. But what you don't want happening is the good people to leave because they're
Yes.
frustrated.
Yeah.
What you want happening is to set this idea of, okay, this is how we work here, this is how we thrive here, this is what we do. And some people may not agree and not trust, and that's okay, but then at least they're clear on it, and then you're not wasting anyone's time, yours or theirs, and then you're hopefully recruiting the right people at
Mhm.
that point because then you're also communicating it externally and it's a consistent experience both in the recruiting and the onboarding. So it's an important skill.
Yeah. And not all places are for all people, right?
No.
And that's absolutely fine. And I absolutely agree. This setting the culture, I talk a lot about civility standards, and the more we set them and enforce them, the more we're going to get it, and the more we're going to root out or notice so-called bad behavior and be able to address it and say, well, this is what we're doing here. Help people, train people, bring them along if they want to be brought along. Because when we go to a new place, we're bringing all the other workplaces before us, right? And our family of origin and all our experiences as to what work looks like. So if work looks a little different here, then what does that really, what does that mean? And so someone can decide, yes, this is for me. No, it's not for me. And the sooner we know all the way around, then things don't fester, and it's much easier to part on good terms rather than, heaven forbid, a lawsuit, right? That's the
Hmm.
extreme on the other end, or something else that goes along. So I want to know a little bit more about you. You told us about your first job, but can you tell us about when you went to college, what you majored in, and then why you went on in law?
Sure. Sure. So in college, I majored in international relations. And instead of a minor, I got a certificate in translation. So, meaning at courthouses, you have these interpreters who, interpret for different languages. Um, and I found that to be really fascinating. I love that, you know, international relations is essentially just public affairs, right? At a big scale. And so I always thought I'd wanted to be a journalist or a lawyer. That was generally kind of where my head was at. I knew I didn't want to be in any of the sciences, not because I hated it, but many people in my family are in medicine and in science, and I figured they're good, we're good. If I'm sick, I'm covered. Um, but I always just really enjoyed writing. I love learning. I love, just really deep diving on things to really uncover the why behind things. And when I was looking for a job, I thought I might want to go to grad school and get to law school. And so I thought, well, like, let me just find a job at a law firm to start, and maybe I'll become a paralegal and then, go from there. Um, I landed a job. There was an opening for an assistant in the marketing department at a large law firm in Miami, which is where I grew up and went to college, and was lucky enough that I landed the job. And it's funny, years later, actually, my boss, this is the woman I mentioned who was a phenomenal mentor, actually told me that of the however many people they interviewed, I was the only one who wore a suit, which I thought was fascinating. Because I think it just sort of set the stage for, she was like, obviously, that's not the reason we chose you, but
Right.
it just kind of spoke to you
Yeah.
were the only one who seemed to take it seriously. Um, yeah, so I ended up there and very quickly fell in love with the marketing and communications side of things. And so while I enjoyed the legal piece and I did actually end up applying and then sort of changed my mind, I fell in love with the communications and ended up at that company for many years, then moved to New York for grad school and got my master's in integrated marketing. and then worked at another law firm. All in, I worked at three law firms, all large law firms in various sizes, but large in the sense that they represent big corporations and banks and tech companies. And I really enjoyed the communications piece of what I did. And I fell into it a little bit kind of by mistake, but also just it was what was available and what was open. And it just worked for me. And I very quickly realized that so much of my job is helping people understand what's happening, why it's happening, and what and how it applies to them and what they need to do.
Mm.
And so I took that and ran with it. And then, I did that for about 15 years and finally a couple years ago just decided I wanted to go off on my own for no other reason than I just was like, I think it's time to try something different and take everything I've learned and I really found my passion in internal communications because I found that when I worked in-house, it either was done really well or it was not done at all. And
Mm.
I saw what happened when it worked well and when it didn't. And so I decided to, when I started Ready Cultures, I decided to go all in on this culture, workplace culture and internal communications because to me it's such a core part of any business. It's the people piece. And the
Mm.
people piece, if you don't get that right, you're not going to get any of it right.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about internal communications. Where, I mean, is that housed in any particular place? I think HR, I think the C-suite, I think it's everywhere. So if it's done right in an organization, is it, where is it housed? Or who's
Yeah.
who's watching it? Who's caring for it and making sure it's going well?
So I'm a firm believer that it needs to fall as its own department. I think communications is and should be its own department. And when I mean communications, I don't just mean internal communications, I mean communications as a whole, like
Sure.
corporate communications. Some companies it falls under HR because either they're a small company, they don't really have a comms function, and HR is the closest sort of people focused group. Sometimes it falls under marketing. Um, Again, I'm a big believer it should fall in its own bucket, its own category, because it touches so many different pieces of a company. I believe that comms people tend to be the most horizontal thinkers after the CEO, just because of the nature of what we do. But it's going to vary by company. And to me, doing it well means less about where it sits and more about how good it is at connecting the dots for people. And what I mean by that is not just saying one thing and doing another, but making sure that the message is tied to meaning and that it's clarified through various consistent messages, whether it's through email or signage or whatever it may be. So to me, that's the most essential. And there's a framework I have called the 3H framework, which stands for head, heart, and hands. And that framework is meant to help guide people do that. Because what I always say is, at a minimum, when you're delivering any message, whether it's written or spoken, you need to answer the head, the heart, and the hands, which is what are the facts, why does it matter, and what do they need to do next? And to me, that's what doing it well looks like. Not doing it well looks like complete silence. Silence is a form of communication, I will
Hmm.
say that, but
Sure.
it's not usually a good form of
Right.
communication. Um, and making sure that it's not just one-way communication, right? I think so many people just broadcast information as opposed to making it a conversation.
Hmm.
The only way you learn is by listening. And listening is a really big part of internal communication. And taking feedback and acting on it is important. I find that some companies will take feedback and do nothing with it, and you're almost better off not taking feedback at that point.
Yeah.
Um, so so to me, while I feel strongly it should be its own little department, I think it's less about where it sits and more about what and how it's doing its job to connect those dots
Hmm.
for people.
I'm just thinking about, so when I think about a healthy work environment, I'm very interested in conflict and having some sort of mechanism for conflict. And people talk about, well, maybe that should sit in HR, or maybe that, the people and culture function, sort of like trying to reimagine what HR is and having these completely different functions of the people and culture. And it sounds like this communication is going to, or at least flow through or be a part of, or um, just trying to imagine when we think about systems, right? How you have that 3H framework that goes throughout. Is your idea that everybody communicates that way, or that there is somebody who's in charge, who's watching to make sure that it is consistently done and done well? What is your, or does it just, as you said, just really vary depending on size?
Ideally, you want someone who does own internal communications to an extent. Now, owning internal communications isn't writing everything for everyone or just being an order taker, right? Because I think that's also something people think like, oh, hi, comms person, please go write these 10 emails for me. That's
Right.
not that. But I do think it's going to be dependent on a company, right? I've worked with companies who have 50 employees and they're not really big enough to maybe have a dedicated internal comms person yet. Maybe it sort of falls on the CMO. Um, but I do think that to me, a better culture starts with better communication.
Mhm.
And so it really is on leadership. And what I mean by leadership is like the top of the company to make it a priority.
Mhm.
And if they're making it a priority, then others will make it a priority. And so there does need to be sort of from the operational piece, someone owning kind of how these things are flowing through the company. So if you have a big announcement, how are you getting talking points to the managers who are supposed to tell their people whatever that news is? Or how are you ensuring that someone is getting information about a new big rollout, right? All of these things are systems and strategies and operational elements. That's all important. But you also need to have a focus and a priority on making sure that it's connecting with the why and ensuring that people are clear on what's expected of them and clear on what they can do to sort of advance whatever that goal is that you're communicating. And so there needs to be buy-in from the top. I think too often companies rely on internal communications as this like band-aid fix. So they'll be like, oh, just, send an email or go fix that problem. And that's not what communications is, right? You can have the best messaging in the world, but if it's not tied to meaning, it's gonna do nothing.
Mhm.
So it does start from the top.
Yeah. As you said in their expectations, and expectations are king, right? That's so much of the problems in an organization is unclear expectations. We're not communicating. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, to what level, what you're supposed to be doing, the why of it, the how of it, all of this, right? That's unclear expectations, and a lot of conflicts arise. And, conflict itself is not bad. Conflict is really good. All this great things can come out of managed conflict, but it's the unmanaged conflict that is problematic, which chiefly arises, not always, but through lack of or just different expectations. So, can you tell us about a time in your career that you experienced a conflict at work, and what happened, and now where you are in your career, if you would do anything differently looking back?
Yeah. So it's actually an experience that it wasn't too long ago, but wasn't quite career, but I was on the board of an organization. And unfortunately there was some disconnect in terms of expectations from the chair of the organization and how the board should be running or functioning. And it led to it basically, so there was this workshop we were doing, and it was supposed to be this training workshop all around marketing and communication, and there was a disconnect. And the person at the top, the chair at the time, wasn't happy with the how it was run and decided to just not show up to the meeting, and then decided to send an email to people saying, this was not how it was supposed to be done. I would have done it this way. And, threw me and a couple other people kind of under the bus on something that we were just completely blindsided by. And it taught me a lot about giving people grace, but also knowing how to set boundaries, right? And so I remember at the time thinking, well, what the heck is going on here? Like we had agreed to do this, and now this person's saying that that's not how they would do it, and is trying to rally people against a group of us. It just felt so childish.
Mhm.
Um, and I remember taking a step back and thinking, well, okay, I can either fight fire with fire
Mhm.
and go all in and just say, how dare you, and all of these things. Sure, that probably wouldn't have done much. Now remember, I come from law firm world where many I loved the people I worked with, but you often had many um stressed lawyers who were focused on high stakes cases
Mhm.
who were very short with you. And
Mhm.
that also taught me, okay, it's not personal. It's not
Mhm.
me. It's
Mhm.
clearly a bigger focus. And so this scenario I'm mentioning about being on the board of this organization, I essentially just texted the woman and I said, "Hey, listen, I see these emails you're sending. Clearly there's been some miscommunication. Can we talk? Let's grab coffee. Let's just level set like what's going on here." Um, and she ignored me,
Mhm.
and I was okay with that. Um, and then it just kind of blew over. Someone else on the board stepped up and said, "This isn't how things, this isn't how we do things." And it more or less resolved itself. And then months later, the person did reach out to me and said, "I'm so sorry. That's not how I should have handled myself." I know she reached out to some of the other people as well. And she said, "I was going through a really tough time in my personal life, and I didn't know how to handle that, and I took it out on everyone else, and I shouldn't have done that, and I'm so sorry." And
Mhm.
we moved on, right? Like it just we moved on. My time at the organization ended just because of, the bylaws. I couldn't be on the board forever. Um, but it was a really great experience because it reminded me that people are
Mhm.
human, things happen, and all you can do is try to communicate and explain or understand. And if you don't get across to the person, you don't get across, but at least you've done all you could to
Mhm.
sort of level set and manage your own expectations and your own boundaries. I didn't, I was more senior at the time. I've been through many years. But it taught me the importance of grace and patience and not taking things personally.
Mhm. That's such a wonderful example. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much going on there. First, and I was thinking about my own responses, getting that kind of email. The first thing I would think is this person is misbehaving, right? So, what is appropriate email etiquette? And it doesn't sound like this is what was going on. So, okay, why is this professional acting this way, especially if it's out of character, right? I think it's
Hmm.
also interesting that that you said working in a law firm with people who are stressed, who are doing these really high stakes things. And so there's this sort of cadence that is about them and not about you. Like, I need this now, or this is happening because of all this other stuff that's going on. And insofar as it's within the realm of civility for that work environment, it can be understood and let go of, right? But even then, I'm sure there are forms of communication that are just too much and not appropriate and need to be addressed, right? Any kind of workplace bullying or doesn't get
Hmm.
excused because people are under pressure, right? But your response, what you could have done could have many of us when we are attacked, we want to defend ourselves. You attacked me publicly. I now have to defend myself publicly. And that is an option that you could have done. And I'm sure, as you said, I could do this. I'm sure other people thought about that too. But you decided to do it in another way. And all we can do in conflict is show up and be
Yeah.
professional and extend that olive branch and be who we want to be, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times in my work, people will say, why do I have to be the grown up? Why do I have to be the one that's always, I'm like, well, who do you want to, what other
Yeah.
option do you have? Do you want to be small? Do you want to diminish yourself? Do you want to act
Right.
unprofessionally just because somebody at a particular time is acting in a particular way? Other people's behavior does not need to dictate our behavior. Our behavior should come
Yeah.
from who we are and what our character is. And how wonderful to find. I mean, that could have been the end of the story, but the end of the story, or at least this stage of the story, comes around to where this person was in this really escalated state. And by not adding insult to injury, that also allows that person to come down and be able to try to make things right. So that's a great story.
Yeah. I'm a big believer in yeah, just giving grace and being human. And now, granted, if that had continued and the behavior was constant, that's a whole other scenario and different story. But I do think that you have to give people a chance. I mean, look, I've had bad days at work. I'm certain I was probably not the greatest in some scenarios, and I can think of a couple where I immediately called back and said, "I'm so sorry, you caught me at a really bad time. Let's start over," right? So I think you just need to put yourself in people's shoes and understand that everyone's human.
Yeah. When I think about workplace culture and having difficult conversations, we know, I mean, the marketplace, things change. Sometimes there's really difficult conversations that need to be had, but there's just in the everyday, we just disagree about whether to go in this direction or that direction, whether to get new chairs or new monitors, right? I mean, like there's just the everyday kind of disagreement that we're going to have. Of course, we're going to have them. And so the question is, are we going to train and develop people to disagree well, or are we going to not? And if we don't, then we're going to have the gossiping that becomes out of control. We're going to have quiet quitting. We're going to have people on the way out mentally. If we don't train people what to do when they have real concerns, instead of saying, well, it's your problem or you're being petty or whatever it might be. And a lot of times women get, oh, you are being a nuisance, a bother, a busybody, whatever, when people have real concerns. So, how do you see that tying into the work that you do, conflict management?
So conflict management to me usually means that people aren't clear on or know what's expected, right? So in an ideal scenario, in an ideal workplace, people don't have to guess. They know what's expected, they know how decisions get made, they feel safe speaking up. And so to me, managing conflict starts with communicating and communicating clearly and asking questions and going back to that basic, what are we solving for? Because so often what I find is that you're saying one thing. I don't know if this has ever happened. I'm sure this happens to many people, even in your personal life, you're talking to someone, your spouse, your friend, whatever, you're having a bit of a tense conversation and you're saying all these things and then they repeat back what you said and it's like they might as well have said it in a different language. It's a completely different perspective. And so remembering that people come at things from different lived experiences and understanding who you're communicating with plays a big role in helping solve for that conflict because you can't just go at things with your own perspective. You need to understand your audience, you need to understand who you're communicating with, and you need to explain it in ways that resonate with them, but also be willing to take feedback and be willing to express any frustrations you have in a way that are constructive
Mhm.
and ultimately lead to a better outcome for all involved and for the business where you work.
I have 100% agree. And as you were talking, I was thinking about community, right? What is community? It is a
Mhm.
give and take. What is communication? But it is a kind of community because it isn't just the words, right? It's never just the words. It's what am I hearing? What does that word mean to me? What does that tone mean to me? What does that way in which you communicated mean to me? How am I understanding it? And so, I hear this quite a lot. The boss, I already said it. They already know. And I'm like, no, they do not know. You don't get this behavior because they know, right? So there's this disconnect. And I think the more we really think about what does it mean to be a good colleague, in other words, what does it mean to be in community, then maybe the more I'm going to be willing to, I don't even think it's going the extra mile, but communicate. So not just I said it, but what is it you heard? And what is it that
Right.
you understood? And now
Right.
what are you going to do? And what do you expect me to do? And this
Yeah.
setting and resetting of expectations, this continued dialogue, so that if we have a habit of dialogue, a habit of setting and resetting expectations, and so if you and I are used to doing this, if I'm not quite clear, I have this relationship with you where I can ask, is this what you meant, or did you mean this? And you might say, no, I meant the third thing. Oh, okay. And then working that and then moving forward.
Yeah. I always tell clients just because you told them doesn't mean they got it. It just, I could say things and no one gets it, right? It just is. It goes back to why, when I think back to in college when I got this degree in interpretation, and I come from a Hispanic family. I speak Spanish, and Spanish in Colombia, which is where I'm from, is very different from the Spanish in Mexico. So even when you're speaking the same language, you're not speaking the same language. And so when I work with clients, that's what I help them sort of realize is what is it that people are hearing and what is it that you're saying and what is it that people are hearing and why is your message not landing, and let's try to fix that because that needs to be bridged, and very often it's because there's this mindset of, well, I told them they should get it. It's like, well, no, there's more to it than let me just send an email or let me send a whatever. And so it's an important piece of it, and that's why I think I said this earlier, is listening is a big part of that.
Mhm.
You can't communicate without listening. Otherwise, you're just yelling into a void.
Yeah.
So it's an important part of it as well.
I'm writing a book right now on generation gaps at work. And what do we do about that? How do we, so it's sort of got this
Mhm.
culture war going on where we vilify, like we're in our generation and we vilify the other. There's something wrong with them, right? How do you see these principles being worked out so that um, we win, right? So that we don't
Mhm.
vilify the other and other them because of the age group they happen to be in? How do you see this communication piece of the head, heart, and hands framework working so that the generations, it's not the gap, it helps us actually be the best company employees we can be.
Well, I mean, like you said, the communication piece is essential because whether you are, excuse me, whether you are a boomer or you're a Gen Z or somewhere in between, you still crave connection and you crave understanding. So to me, it starts with setting foundational baseline, clear expectations, and then working from there, right? So if you're setting expectations that say, here is how we work, and this is where you can find things, and this is why this is important, and this is what we're going to tolerate, and this is what we're not going to tolerate. You're creating these sort of guardrails for people. So regardless of whether they're in one generation or the other, they're all coming at it with this understanding that this is the environment they're going to be, working in. And then you go to that relational piece, which is you can't communicate just like in marketing, right? If you think about take look at marketing, when you market a product to a person, you're not marketing it in the same way to every person. It's not a one size fits all. And then that same mindset applies in communication. How you communicate to one audience is not how you necessarily communicate to another audience. You need to know and understand your audience, and you need to meet them where they're at. And so some people may um, receive information better face to face. Some may prefer video, some may prefer writing, some may prefer some combination of all of those. And so the more you can tailor what you're, you know, guiding people through to their, not just, I mean, yes, this example is generation, but to sort of their, what I call persona, the better you're going to have, better outcomes you're going to have. And so in your case with the generations, I think that applies. You need some foundational guardrails and you need to meet them where they're at.
Yeah, great. So my last question for you is, as you look into the future of work, what do you think needs to happen so that not only will all workers be treated with dignity and respect, but that people will be encouraged to thrive and flourish?
Future of work. Well, I think it needs to continue to be people-centric. Um, I think a lot of companies today are sort of riding this trend wave of AI first. And I'm a big believer that if you're AI first, but your people don't know how it applies to their day-to-day, you're buzzword first.
Mm.
And AI, you can be AI first, but people still need to drive it, right? So you still need to have people to get the AI to work. And so to me, the future of work, I think two things. One is really, really investing in clear communication that's compassionate, that's clear and sets expectations and creates alignment. But it's also in rethinking how and what you define as success. I think a lot of businesses today are focused on profits at all costs, which again, businesses, profits are important. That is a very important part of a business. But to get to that, you need people to do that work. And if you are forgetting the people piece, you're not quite going to land the profits piece that I think you think you are. And so it needs to continue to be people centric. It needs to be done in a way that's, you know, respectful and compassionate and clear. Without clarity, you're not going to get very far. You need to take the guesswork out of it for people.
Yeah. Those are great words to end on. Well, thank you, Alejandra, for your time today. It's been such a joy speaking with you.
It was so lovely. Thanks for having me. Love this topic, so I appreciate the chance to talk about it.
Absolutely. Well, take care. Alejandra, thank you so much for being on Conflict Managed. I think in my 160 some odd episodes, I haven't spoken with somebody who was doing communication, internal communication specifically. And obviously, what a very important and vital piece to having a healthy work environment, right? So that adults know what's going on. And I love the head, hearts, and hand answering those questions so that people can not guess and know what it is they need to do so they can do good work. Conflict Managed is produced by Third Party Workplace Conflict Restoration Services and hosted by me, Mary Brown. You can find us online at 3pconflictrestoration.com. Come back. We have new episodes every Tuesday. And if you want to watch this conversation between the two of us, you can go to YouTube at 3P Conflict Restoration. At 3P Conflict Restoration. If you would like and follow, subscribe wherever you're listening or watching this, I very much appreciate it. And if you haven't had a chance to check out my latest book, How to Be Unprofessional at Work, Tips to Ensure Failure, it's 80 tips of what not to do. It considers what we ought to do instead to have a healthy work environment. And I believe my newest book on winning the generation wars is going to be coming out in November. So more to come on that. Our music is courtesy of Dove Pilot. And remember, conflict is normal and expected. Let's deal with it. Until next time, take care.